Hello, thank you for tuning in to watch my video as part of NF Learn 19. I'm hoping to be talking about the first principle number one, starting where students are at, building on where students are at. I was very lucky to study with Lucy Green, who you may or may not know was crucial in the development of musical futures and their kind of modus operandi, the curriculum. And Lucy spent a lot of time working on and thinking about, writing about how identity and learning are very closely connected, and that informed my own research, which is what the rest of the video will be about. So I suppose the crucial takeaways for me are to do with the opportunities that we provide as teachers. Given the right opportunities, students can develop in certain ways, and given the wrong ones, they'll develop, I suppose, in other ways. It's hard to say what's really right or wrong. But I think it's right or wrong for the individual, or better or less good for individuals. And our job as teachers is to see who are the people we're teaching, where do they want to be, how can we help them get there, and what kinds of learning opportunities can we provide, facilitate, curate for those things to happen. So in the nutshell, it's just about being sensitive to who the students are and not letting our agenda as a teacher, what's the word I'm looking for, impinge or direct too much what it is we curate for our students. Hello, welcome to my talk about identity realization, learning realization, and the snowball self. This is developed from work that I did into research for my PhD a few years ago, which developed into a book about drummers. So that research was based on identity generally, and I applied it to kit drummers, drum kit players, and the research was used again just this year actually for a publication of a book of sociology for music teachers, which I co-published with Hildegard Freulich. The work, this model I'm going to talk about, identity realization, learning realization, and the snowball self, it's sociological in orientation, which means that it deals with meaning and meaning making for people in social or socio-cultural contexts. So identity is about who we are, and as I will contend, it's also about learning. Lucy Green, at the end of her 2002 book, How Popular Musicians Learn, she says that learning and identity are intrinsically connected. And reading that is what started me out on this journey, trying to figure out how those two are connected, although Lucy had given plenty of indicators. The model of the snowball self is, it's a metaphor. It imagines the self as a snowball, one's self, one's concept of oneself, and one's doing things. It imagines that the snowball is rolling around on an infinite mountainside, if such a thing were possible, gathering identity and learning, which is the snow. The snowball grows over time. It gets larger. But bits of it are covered up as we develop identities that cover up previous identities. We become different things, different people in a way. We learn more things. Sometimes we forget things, so things get covered up. The snowball grows, and also as the snowball rolls around, we show different parts of ourselves, different parts of ourself to different people in different contexts, different places. So that's the broad concept of the snowball self. It takes place in time. It takes place in culture, and it takes place in space. Those are pretty obvious, but it's worth bearing in mind that those factors impact on the development of the snowball self, on the realization of the snowball self, and that the snowball self is realized in those contexts. So it's the idea of having several identities is not new. I propose that there are what we could call meta-identities, which are sort of larger concepts you have of oneself. I, for instance, think of myself as a drummer. That may be my principal meta-identity. And I'm a teacher. I'm also a husband, a father. These are things that loom large in my life or feature heavily in my life. So those I would call meta-identities. And within each of those, there are perhaps contextual identities, wherein I'm a jazz drummer, or I'm a drummer on a function gig, or I'm a drummer in a variety of ways. The identities also overlap, as you can see that in the model here. The meta-identities cross over because I'm always a drummer. Sometimes that's more important in a given situation than being a father or a husband or a teacher. So these things overlap in various ways. Hence the suggestion of the movement of the snowball self. Lucy Green, again in 2014 and in 2011, she suggested that identity is both constructed and construed. I heard her suggest this at a talk in 2009, which led me to think of the word realization, which has two meanings, and I've from that developed the notion of active identity realization and passive identity realization. So in the sense that something is realized as in made real, or realized as in, aha, one understands what that is. And I think the same can be applied to learning. So active learning realization and passive learning realization, which are not the same as identity realization. Active identity realization is making yourself into who you want to be, or making an identity, even that perhaps you don't especially intend, but it's the making, the doing, the creating of that identity for yourself. So for instance, in my case of being a drummer, I learn to play the drums, I play in bands, I buy drums, I set them up in my house, I do all the things that I think a drummer does. Passive identity realization is understanding who you are, accepting, knowing. For instance, I remember when I was teaching, I moved to London to become rich and famous some years ago, and I've been teaching in a school alongside trying to become rich and famous as a drummer. And after a couple of years, I was seeing the children off with their parents after school, and someone said, "Mr. Smith." And in that moment, I had a sort of dawning realization of my identity as a teacher. I hadn't really thought of myself as a teacher before, although I've been teaching for a while. Active learning realization, then, is doing the learning, making the learning happen. For instance, going to classes, engaging in a community of practitioners, attending jam sessions, if you're becoming a drummer, for instance, as I did. Passive learning realization is learning things by accident, picking things up along the way. So it's the stuff that we don't as teachers necessarily intend to teach, but that people learn anyway. One may learn that one is not as good as others in the class. One may learn that one is fantastic at reading music. You might learn that you don't get along well with a given teacher. So we can learn negative, positive sorts of things. So here is the model of the snowball self, with the identities being realized and learning being realized. And the square in the middle there with all these intersecting lines indicates, I think quite clearly, that these are all interrelated, that they require each other to happen. So sort of in summary, passive identity realization is a moment of discovery, of learning. It's identity realization, but it requires you to discover or learn something about yourself. So identity is learning in that context. Active identity realization requires active learning realization. So you can't become a drummer, a teacher, a fill in the blank, without also actively learning what that is, what the things that are required to become that person, to fulfill that identity. Passive learning realization is a byproduct of active identity realization and active learning realization. So unless you're actively realizing an identity or actively realizing some learning, you are unlikely to be passively realizing the learning also. So active identity realization and active learning realization lead to passive identity realization and passive learning realization, which in turn can lead to active identity realization and active learning realization. So what are the implications of this for music education? I think there are ramifications for us all, as learners, as educators, regardless of the degree to which we might consider ourselves to be teachers. People are always aware of who they are, and this affects their learning. Sometimes that awareness is more conscious than others, but people always have a sense of who they are, how they fit into a given situation. And in teaching situations, that's crucial to bear in mind. We are also aware of who we want to be. This affects our learning in various ways, including choices about what we learn and whether we choose to pay attention to what we're being taught or to whom we see teaching us. I, for instance, paid a lot of respect to John Bonham from Led Zeppelin, the drummer in Led Zeppelin. He taught me most of what I know on the drums. Unintentionally, we've never met. And that's something that Bourdieu and Passeron refer to as pedagogic authority, this sense of to whom a learner ascribes the authority to teach them. So what we are taught and what we learn impact our sense of self in so many ways. Etienne Wenger suggests that some of our greatest insights often have the forgotten familiarity of the obvious about them. So in a sense, I've said nothing very new here, but I found the learning realization, identity realization, snowball self model to be helpful to think about how it is that we learn and how we become and how we are. I think we would all do well to remember, as educators and as learners, how important it is for our snowball selves and for others' snowball selves. Thank you.